Good evening, everybody, or hello. My name is Teo Yu Yen, and together with Sharon George, Ian Chong, Linda Lim, and Joanne Liao, I'm one of the editors of Academia SG. Welcome to Academia SG's Singapore Studies Junior Scholar Seminar Series. If this is the first time you're attending one of our webinars, welcome. If you've been following this series, welcome back, and thank you very much for your support. This series was set up to create space for junior scholars to share work in progress and for them to be in dialogue with a more senior scholar as well as with you, multidisciplinary audiences. Our speaker today is Yeong Wai Kit. Wai Kit received his MA at University College London. He is an educator, writer, and PhD candidate at NIE NTU. And he's researching poetry memorization in Singapore classrooms. Wai Kit was a secondary level English literature and language teacher for several years and the organizer of Singapore's National Poetry Recitation Competition. Today, he will be talking about his PhD work titled Memorize for What? Exploring Poetry Memorization in Singapore Classrooms. After Wai Kit speaks for about 30 minutes, we will hear comments from the discussant, Dr. Julie Blake. Dr. Blake is an innovator in the field of education and literature. She's a visiting fellow at Manchester Metropolitan University and co-founder and director of Poetry by Heart, which is a national schools poetry speaking competition. Dr. Blake also co-founded and co-directs the Full English Education Limited, which is an artisan enterprise to re-resource English for the digital age. We're very grateful that Dr. Blake has agreed to lend her expertise and support as the discussant for today. After Wai Kit and Julie speak, we will have about 20 minutes for Q&A with audience members. So please note that the session is being recorded, and to minimize distractions, please turn off your microphones and cameras when the speakers are speaking. You may type your questions into the chat box, but we ask that you do this only when we are in the Q&A section so as not to distract the speakers and other audience members during the presentation. Okay, with that, let me welcome Yeong Wai Kit to begin his presentation. Wai Kit, please.
Thank you, Yo Yen. Right. Hi, everyone. I'm Wai Kit. Right. I'll just share my slides. All right. Let me just can show as well. Just a moment. Right. All right, are you seeing my slides?
Yes, it's perfect.
You can hear me? Perfect. Thank you,
yes, perfect.
Right, yes. So my presentation is entitled Memorize for What? Exploring Poetry Memorization in Singapore Classrooms. So essentially, I'm exploring how students have experienced learning poetry by heart, right? And how this journey can shape their understanding of texts, of themselves, and of the very process of learning itself, right? And I'm going to be zooming through the earlier sections so that I can move on to the findings and discussion and Q&A, right? But I'm happy to return to any slides later if necessary. So here's an outline of my presentation. I'll first offer a brief introduction and the theoretical underpinnings, the research context, the methodology and study design, the findings and discussion before concluding. So first, right, why memorize poetry when you can just look it up, right? So poets and educators have long argued, right, that poetry enriches our language and our imagination in ways that other kinds of texts cannot, right? So W.H. Auden famously defined poetry as memorable speech, right? Because it distills complex emotions and ideas into precise, impactful language. And its rhythm and structure make it naturally easier to remember. And that's why, as the poet John Patterson puts it, a poem is a little machine for remembering itself, right? So memorizing poetry allows us not only to internalize its words, but to inhabit the poet's voice, right? It creates what scholars have described as a merging of the other with the self, or of the text. And so this process fosters a deeper connection to language which offers a transformative and reflective experience that goes beyond mere reading. And why should we memorize poetry, right? When we can simply look it up, right? Especially in the age of AI. So now we have some insights from the learning sciences, right? And what they're telling us is that it's the same reason why students still need to memorize their times tables, right? In maths class, even though calculators already exist, right? Because it's about building automaticity, right? It's about freeing up working memory for higher order thinking. And it helps to counteract the effects of cognitive offloading, right? Like if we rely too heavily on tools like AI, right? And in fact, interestingly, the research shows that reduced memory engagement, right, which is this cognitive offloading, correlates with the decline in IQ scores around the developed world, which is a reversal of what's known as the Flynn effect, right, in recent decades. And that's perhaps because underusing our memory systems undermines learning. And so this reinforces a key point, right, that memorization isn't outdated, right? It's still vital because in a digital age, robust internal knowledge allows technology to complement rather than to replace human thinking. So now moving on to the second section, let's examine the theoretical underpinnings. And this study is based on Judith Langer's envisionment-building approach, right? So in her book, Envisioning Literature, Langer introduces the conceptual term of an envisionment, meaning it's the mental picture that we have of something, like of a text. So for example, when we read a poem, right, we develop new ideas and thoughts and feelings, which contributes to a text world in the mind, right? And that's an envisionment. And Langer offers this matrix that outlines 4 possible situations in the envisionment building literature classroom, right, based on language and concepts. So by language, she means literary vocabulary like metaphor or similes, right, or symbolism, and the words of the text, right? And by concepts, she means the deeper ideas and meaning and the significance behind the language. So students might have neither the concepts nor the language, or just the concepts but not the language, or the language but not the concepts, right? But the ideal is for students to have both the language and the concepts, right? So Langer's framework is helpful for us to understand how poetry memorization can contribute towards achieving the same goals, right? Of mastering both the language and the concepts. And we can map and adapt and apply this framework when outlining the findings later. Now, there's another field of research that's helpful and relevant to our study of poetry memorization, which is the learning sciences. And in brief, it's an evidence-based interdisciplinary field that integrates insights from fields like neuroscience and psychology and education to enhance teaching and learning. So within this framework, I focus on 3 active learning strategies, right? First is retrieval practice, which involves recalling previously learned information. So for example, low-stakes quizzes can help to strengthen memory through practice. So it's not just the quizzing that tests the learning. The quizzing is the learning. And secondly, there's learning by drawing and writing, which is supported by the production effect, right? Like self-generated materials like visuals can reinforce content in long-term memory. So drawing, right, is a form of dual coding, which means presenting information in not just verbal, but visual ways. And that promotes visualization and active cognitive engagement. And finally, embodied learning, in which gestures and physical movements can deepen learning and boost engagement. So movements, right, like when enacting, right, poetry, for example, this has been shown to improve memory performance. So together, the frameworks of envisionment building and the learning sciences provide a robust foundation for designing engaging evidence-based learning experiences that can foster deeper understanding and meaningful connections. So let's move on to the research context. Now, this brings us to our research gap and significance. So existing studies highlight the benefits of poetry memorization, right? But we still know very little about how students actually experience it in real-world classrooms, right? Because there's just very little empirical research on that. So that's a real gap right there. And also, the learning sciences offer effective memory techniques, but they're often neglected and underused, right? So for example, there's overwhelming evidence that retrieval practice is powerfully effective. but the students who need it most are often disinclined to use it, right? So how might it work in practice? And more research is needed in actual classrooms. And this study, right, explores how to bridge this gap, given that Singapore, right, as an Anglophone Asian country, provides a case in point, right, to understand how poetry memorization can foster active, imaginative thinking and learning, and deeper emotional connections, like the joy of learning itself. So our central research question asks, what experiences do Singapore secondary school literature students have when engaging in the process of learning poetry by heart in the envisionment-building literature classroom? And a key sub-question would be exploring this. What factors influence students' engagement in envisionment building while memorizing poetry as perceived by students and observed by teachers, right? So we're looking at both student perceptions and teacher observations. Now let's proceed to the next section, which is about the methodology and the study design. So to explore students' experiences, I designed and conducted an exploratory case study, right? And this was part of a larger study involving 3 schools, which is, well, basically my PhD project, right? And let's focus on one of the sites, which is a neighborhood school, which we'll call Chesterville Secondary School. And the study focused on a mixed ability secondary 3 literature class. And we had 4 teachers participating as observers and interviewees. And of course, 26 students. And the study ran from October to November 2024 and involved 3 one-hour weekly workshop sessions, which I facilitated. So in terms of data collection, right, that included interviews with the teachers, focus group discussions with students, audio and video recordings of lessons and performances, document analysis of the student journals and handouts, and few notes with my observations and reflections. So altogether, these sources provided comprehensive data about how students engaged with poetry memorization in this context. Now, in the workshops, right, these were our activities. So the challenge for students was to memorize 1 poem of their choice, right? And the focus was on guiding students through the process with explicit guidance and engaging activities based on the principles of envisionment building and the learning sciences. So the workshops were structured across 3 sections, right? Sessions. So session 1 involves students being introduced to techniques based on the learning sciences, right? And of course, on poetry memorization. And we had activities that included a think, pair, share, a gallery walk, and a journal quick write reflection activity. And in session 2, we introduced active learning techniques, right? So students engaged in a jigsaw dictation race, right? To engage in retrieval practice. And they would draw, right, the images of the poem, right? To visualize selected lines of the text. And also poetry charades, right? They were acting out lines for their classmates to guess, right? So that was, of course, harnessing embodied learning. And then they were reflecting at the end. So the reflections were vital. And then in session 3, the focus was on recall and on recording and reflection. So the students dictated their selected poems. They co-constructed the class poem, right? Meaning there was a poem that the entire class went through, and that was a class poem, right? Through group collaborations. And they also performed their selected poem, right? In small groups. So it was a low pressure, low stakes activity, right? And this was through video recordings. So they were helping to video record one another, right? And they could do like multiple retakes. They could perform only as much as they were able to, right? Really low pressure. And so I also incorporated research-backed strategies like spacing, right? Which is to spread learning out across time, and interleaving, which is switching between tasks. Yeah. And also we provided a safe space for what's known as productive failure, which is, in other words, it's all right to fail, right? We need to provide a safe space for that. And it's really more about the process rather than product. And this approach honored the students' efforts and abilities by fostering a nurturing environment for growth and creativity. So students selected from a list of suggested poems provided, and they were free to add or suggest poems of their choice as well. All right. So, and in fact, that's the link that they were provided to. And here's a sample of the poems that they selected. So there was Invictus by W.E. Henley, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud by Wordsworth, Conceptual Art, and that's a Singapore poem, right, by Arthur Yap, and Death Be Not Proud by John Donne, and I Worried by Mary Oliver. So here's showing the number of students selecting each poem. And as you can see, the most popular poems were the relatively contemporary ones, right, by Arthur Yap and by Mary Oliver. And I should add that all of these are not exactly easy poems, right? They reflect not only lexical difficulty, but also thematic complexity. Now, just a brief note about data analysis. So I conducted these processes of initial analysis and review and open coding and recoding and the clustering of themes and threads. And my analysis included journal entries, right, in which students were recounting their frustrations and anxieties. And it was important that we analyze not just the polished performances, but also the draft, the NG versions, right, like videos in which students fluff their lines, right, and laugh at themselves. Because forgetting is a crucial part of the learning process. So it's an opportunity to strengthen memory and deepen understanding over time. And here's a quick sample of what my coding looks like, right? So here's an excerpt from Invictus, the main class poem that's used, right? And here there are some sample student responses. So for example, here's Etik's response, right, which reflects confusion and resistance. He's struggling with both the language and the concepts as described by Langer. And then next, here's Bruce. He provides a basic interpretation, right, of the text. So he's grasping here the poem's themes of bravery and resilience, but he's still missing the nuances of the language. And then finally, there's Xiao Dong here, demonstrating a deeper engagement. So he's connecting with the poem's meaning and its linguistic features, he's discussing techniques like alliteration, and that helps him memorize and analyze the poem at a more sophisticated level. So now, on to the findings and discussion. Now, this graph illustrates students' perceived relevance of learning poetry by heart that's gathered through pre- and post surveys at a workshop, right? So before the workshop, as you can see, most students were either neutral or they felt it was irrelevant, right? So there was initial skepticism. But after the workshop, there was a significant shift. So over 60% of the class now felt that poetry memorization was somewhat or very relevant, which suggests that perhaps even in an age of AI and digital tools, right, engaging approaches can help students rediscover the value of learning poetry by heart. But what exactly did students experience, right? So based on Langer, I created a matrix of students' experiences of poetry memorization. So this x-axis shows the level of conceptual enjoyment and engagement that students reflected during the process of learning poetry by heart. And this y-axis shows the level of conceptual understanding that were demonstrated by the students' responses. So here's what the matrix looks like as a whole, and it's not static, right? It's possible for students to straddle multiple categories because it's a whole spectrum, right? So let's look at it part by part. There's four different categories here, different kinds of experiences. So category one, that represents disengaged learners who show a low understanding of the poem's meaning and minimal engagement with the language, right? And there were very few students in this category because, well, it's a literature class, but they still exist, right? And they displayed resistance and apathy. They lacked interest and motivation. So they may also hesitate to engage due to a fear of failure or discomfort with the task. So for example, Etik here shared, he said, I quote, "I don't like poems. Poetry is boring and no use." Right? And he also mentioned feeling disconnected from its relevance, right? Despite understanding some critical messages. And actually, he never wanted to take literature, and he much preferred principles of accounts, POA, right? So I triangulated with the teachers, and they're completely aware of this case, right? But POA just wasn't possible because there just aren't enough POA teachers, right? And he did score better in literature than in maths, right? So in terms of subject allocation, right, when it's influenced by exam results and manpower constraints, that can all contribute to disengagement. All right, now category two, right, moving on, that's surface explorers, right? And so this would be students who use language in ways that suggest understanding, but they only engage with poetry at a rather superficial level. So for example, right, some adopt a utility-driven mindset. They focus on tests on exam performance. So Wahid said, for example, maybe he can help in exams, right? Or others focus on unrelated material. So Luke here was sharing a class poem, None. However, I memorized the electromagnetic spectrum, and then he proceeds to list the entire spectrum out in detail. Right? And finally, some enjoy playfulness and social connections, right? And for some of them, poetry is for social capital, right? As one said, I like to tell my friends all this majestic language. It makes me feel like a linguist. That's what Fahim noted, right? So, I mean, play itself, right, is perfectly fine. It's important, rather. But at the same time, these approaches, while engaging, right, it doesn't necessarily lead to deeper conceptual understanding. So we need to note that. Okay, so now category 3 represents conceptual builders. So these are students who connect with the deeper ideas of a poem, but they struggle to articulate them. Yeah, so with literary language, with language for the text. So these students experience what's called desirable difficulties, right? Grappling with complex ideas and challenging language. So, for instance, Yusof here described his frustration. He could remember parts of the poem, but not the entire poem. And there was Quentin who shared a similar struggle. He said it was very difficult. It took many attempts to remember just one line, right? But he managed to persevere. So all that persistence and curiosity and emotional investment showed effort in building a strong conceptual foundation, even if their fluency was still developing. And finally, for category 4, that highlights empowered thinkers. So students who demonstrate a deep connection with both the language and the concepts of a poem. And these students made personal connections to the poem's themes and imagery and language, right? So, for example, Selena here shared, right, that she was awestruck at how people articulate human emotions in words. Poetry is much more than words on paper. The art is completed by the receiver. And then Jessica here reflected on Arthur Yap's conceptual art, right? And she said it exhibited how everything leaves a mark, which deeply resonates with her, right? And she said, as I believe that we always leave a mark in whatever we do. So this category reflects personal growth, a sense of ownership, right, and confidence in expressing both the meaning and the language of the poem. So interestingly enough, if we go back to Jessica's points, right, and her insights in the poem only emerged, right, after she memorized it, right, and it's a complex poem, right? So she reflected on the significance of the poem's metaphor, right, which is how every text, every person, and every phenomenon leaves an after image. So the poem itself left an after image in her mind, right, which showed its lasting impact. And that's the kind of attention to detail that students reflected. So, for example, Mike here took a systematic approach and used this checklist to learn the poem by heart, right? He really reflected commitment to structure, to repetition. So, empowered thinkers here, right? They not only explored what they liked about the poems, but also why specific lines were memorable. So, for example, Diana's journal here showed metacognitive reflections, right? She wrote lines out from Death Be Not Proud. She sketched an image of the Grim Reaper, and of the Grim Reaper, and she deepened her connection with the poem, for example. And students reflected very deeply on how memorizing poetry changed them. So Irene's journal here reviews research on Mary Oliver's life, right, including her self-initiated drawing, which was a way of connecting with her words on a personal level. And also detailed journaling was very common, right? Day-by-day journaling, when Selena here recorded her emotional journey while learning Invictus, right? She was capturing her evolving thoughts line by line, right? And they also documented snack points, which are specific challenges or obstacles, and how they were overcome, like Diana did here in Death Be Not Proud on the poem. So finally, this process also prompted artistic creativity, with students using illustrations to express their interpretations of the text. So let's explore the factors, right, influencing envisionment building through learning poetry by heart, especially in the context of high-stakes assessments in Singapore. Right? Now, in terms of assessment considerations, so in our national exams, right, poetry is only assessed in the unseen section, right, meaning that students analyze a poem they've never studied before and they write an essay about it. So there's no direct or immediate assessment incentive for memorizing poetry, right, compared to short quotations from prose or drama, which are part of assessed set texts. So before the workshop, right, there were some students who dismissed its value of learning poetry by heart, but later their perspective shifted, right? And finally, right, so there was that sense of schema building as well. And the teachers as well, like Mr. Theophilus here pointed out, he said, you can love poetry all you want, but you need to make sure you're able to meet those assessment needs, right? So you need to strike a balance between fostering appreciation for poetry and meeting exam-oriented objectives. And time, right? So time is a critical factor for envisionment building, right? So research highlights that it takes time, but in reality, a packed curriculum leaves very little room for what's perceived as extras, right? So there were students who reflected this. Teachers also faced challenges, and the time constraints are especially evident, not just in upper secondary, but also the lower secondary classes, right? So here we see the tension between the time-intensive nature of poetry memorization and the demands of an already packed curriculum. And then in terms of student engagement and understanding, that's central to enrichment building. Now, one of the teachers I interviewed, right, memorably compared to poems to a durian, right? So there's a thorny exterior of difficulty, and that often puts students off, right? Even though if they pry open, there's rich rewards within. And the readiness matters, right? So there were students who shared the struggle, the teachers likewise shared, and it was Mr. Theophilus here who shared, right, that the poem becomes like a durian, right? And as he said, right, students will only memorize things they want to memorize. Like just because the teacher says, oh, I like this poem, so we'll memorize it, like Jabberwocky and so on. But will they? Of course not, right? There's no way. So we need to balance student readiness with their sense of autonomy to make poetry more engaging and meaningful. Okay, so we are rounding up. Let's consider some implications and discussion points for envisionment building through learning poetry by heart. So firstly, text selection, right? So students benefit from autonomy and choice in text selection, right? But perhaps teachers could also afford to surface inspiring poems and not just meaningful ones, because all the poems we teach in class are meaningful, but only a few are inspiring. They journey with us through life, right? So it's important to balance the desirable difficulties, right? Like students can begin small, right? Just learn 2 lines by heart, right? And then maybe a stanza. And then also student written poems might be helpful, right? If we think of spoken word tradition, right? Let's look at relevance and engagement. Then in terms of pedagogical and assessment approaches, right? Memorization can offer benefits beyond exams if it's scaffolded with guidance, right? It as a low stakes, enjoyable, reflective activity. And then in terms of transference and application, right? Retrieval practice, learning by drawing, embodied learning, all of that can be helpful, not just in literature classrooms, but for other subjects. And some of these activities like storyboarding, multimedia performance, right, help students to connect with text in diverse and creative ways. So let's conclude, right? In terms of limitations and future directions, right? Yes, there are some clear limitations. There's a short data collection period, a small sample size, and hence limited generalizability, right? It's a case study, so we can't establish causal links, right? But at the same time, there are future research opportunities here that this case study surfaces, right? So there could be longitudinal studies, mixed method studies, right? Neuroscience and brain imaging on literature and poetry teaching, and also the impact of AI on literature education, right? And that's increasingly important in today's context. So in conclusion, right? Now, this study highlights the enduring importance of human memory in an age of AI and digital tools, right? So students need long-term schema building, right? And that's emphasized by cognitive scientists and educators alike. So this research study provides some real-world insights into how memorization practice can support this process. And even a very brief intervention like this one demonstrated potential benefits, right? So memorization not only fosters deep engagement and cognitive habits, right, but also sparks interest in poetry, and it opens possibilities to applying learning strategies across subjects. And at the same time, we need to be cognizant that the effectiveness of such approaches depends on addressing key factors, right? Like promoting student engagement and readiness while navigating very practical considerations like time and assessment constraints. And all of this really raises a larger question about the purpose of literature education itself today. So maybe the question isn't so much about whether we should learn poetry by heart, right? Which I'm suggesting we should, right? But it's more about how can we create suitable conditions such that students will be more likely to be inclined to choose to carry poems with them throughout life, right? And in that way, we can really achieve lifelong envisionment building. Okay, so with that, I'd like to conclude, and these are my references. I'm just going to show these as well. And then also, I'd like to acknowledge all of these very important people. And also, I'd like to point out that there's a paper about this subject as well. If you're interested, do check it out right there. And in terms of acknowledgements, I'd like to especially credit my supervisor, Prof. Angelia Poon, right? And my thesis advisory committee, Prof. Suzanne Chu, Dr. Flossie Chua, NIEL faculty members and graduate students, funding support of the NTU RSS Research Scholarship. And thank you, Dr. Julie Blake, right? And Poetry by Heart, right? We've been speaking last year as well, like on the same subject, and Academia SG, right? Of course, and MOE and all the participants and Poetry Festival Singapore, right? And family and friends. So thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Wai Kit, for sharing your fascinating work and giving such a rich presentation in such a short time. You managed to cover so much so clearly. So now I'll turn the time over to Dr. Julie Blake, who will give her comments. Julie.
Thank you, and thank you for talking us through your slides. It's really fascinating, and I've got so many things to discuss that 10 minutes won't cover it, but I'll make a start. What I really liked about this study, and obviously I've seen it evolve. So what I really valued in this is the much more explicit thinking than there's been in earlier studies about the evidence from learning science. It's not something I particularly take easily to. I'm much more on the side of poetry and in a way what the poem is doing, but I think it's really important work to think about that in terms of learning science. And I thought that from all of the possible directions you could have gone in from that, I really like the way you've built this framework on the idea of envisionment. It feels very organic to the study and teaching of literature. But what I felt that really enabled you to do is to set up a model by which you could track pupil engagement. It enabled you to construct this matrix of pupil engagement in this activity. And I think that modeling is something that's been missing in the other studies. They've tended to be more discursive, perhaps more historical, and this gives us a framework as teachers and educators to think about what we're doing from a kind of classroom sense of things. So that matrix is incredibly helpful. I also really liked it that you focused in on pupil voice. Now, I would say that although your study will almost certainly be the first study to present a pupil experiential perspective, we at Poetry by Heart have been collecting pupil voice data of our participants, but we've got so much of it that we haven't had time to actually work with it or analyze it. So this is really pleasing because it also gives me a framework for thinking about that when we come to do that. But this is a discussion, not just me talking on. So one of the questions I wanted to ask you was really about that matrix. And there are some glimpses in the slides you have here of change, of a shift between before and after. That's most evident in the bar graph where you ask them, you know, was it relevant? And afterwards they were able to say yes more often than before. But actually that matrix, I was thinking about how incredibly powerful it would be if you were able to benchmark where students were at the beginning of the intervention and then to look at where they were at the end of the intervention. And I don't know whether the data allows that, but because it's a short intervention, three sessions, but I wondered how many of those young people were already at that stage in their learning, or to what extent the intervention made a difference. In terms of your study, I think that it's fantastic what you've got, and it might be something that is a further study to be able to do that. You've built the model. That's a fantastic achievement. But I wonder whether you wanted to comment on that.
Thank you so much, Julie. Yes, yeah, I think that's a really important question about, like, in a way, what's the value that the study brings as well. I mean, in terms of where the students are at versus how after the process. So the short answer is that it's really difficult in the context of a very brief intervention to be able to say for sure where the students were at, because the time, these were literally just 1 hour sessions, right? 3 1-hour sessions. And yeah, so it's just so hard to get data. So we did conduct I did conduct pre and post surveys, and also we were looking at the student work. I did triangulate by checking with the teachers in terms of especially after the entire study was over, right, about where the students were and in terms of their readiness. So because I also didn't want to be influenced by the teachers' impressions, right, about specific students, for example, before the study, right, so that I would come in with a clean slate as well, right? So we had to balance conflicting imperatives. So in short, in terms of how many were already at that stage, it's likely that based on my understanding of after speaking with the students and teachers, that, well, their initial tendencies and inclinations were more or less widened, but those who felt that it was were neutral towards learning poetry by heart, that was a significant shift, that many of them then were more attuned towards the practice, right? Whereas those who were dead against it, for example, their attitudes didn't shift very much. Their competencies likely did not improve much as well. Yeah, but then again, this is a short study, so that's it would be ideal, yes, to be able to benchmark before and after, of course. Yeah.
But I think that's what's exciting, is that no one's built this model before, this matrix. You've built it, it opens the way, and that's when I think research gets really exciting, when it's generative. It's not just something that exists in its own world and doesn't go anywhere. This feels like really generative research, that other people could take that model and then say, okay, well, what would it take in terms of how we teach this to move people between the categories? Because at the end of the day, that's, if you're looking for well-developed literary students of literature, you are looking to move them round that. So thank you for that. I think the other thing that I was really interested in your study was the value of what you and I have spent a lot of time thinking about in a world of increasing AI dominance, and this idea of cognitive offloading. I think that there's something really important here, and I think that it's something that other studies have alluded to, but they tend to do it in quite perhaps sentimental ways. And one of the things I admire about your work is that you care passionately about what you're doing, but you're not sentimental about poetry or poetry education. So this idea of what it is about poetry that that might have something special at a time when this cognitive offloading is potentially a problem. I wondered whether you want to say a bit more about that, because you skipped over that quite quickly in the presentation, and yet I think given the times we live in, it's really significant.
Yes, yeah. I mean, well, it's all the rage now because of AI, right? So if we think of the risks of cognitive offloading, this is not, of course, an issue that is plaguing literature education. It's all of education, because in a way it's also speaks to what the purpose of education is about in the first place, right? And it boils down to very different conceptions of what education entails. So if we think that students if were to learn a poem by heart so that they can score in the exam, so that it's for a piece of paper, essentially, it's for a degree which will get them a good job, that's a utilitarian kind of mindset and framework. And if one maintains that mindset, then, well, what's to say that they should use any means possible to try and get there? If the AI, for example, can help them to achieve that, then is that the purpose of education? As opposed to if the purpose of it, like especially in literature education, is lifelong envisionment building, in which is the process that matters, then obviously our entire mindset would be different, right? Then I mean, just to draw a comparison, if we think of like a marathon, right? And this is a metaphor that Daisy Christodoulou has famously raised, that if we think of the competitors in a marathon, right? Why can't they just take a cab, right, and just like reach the finish line? Well, because the process matters, because they need to stick to the rules, right? And that the process of preparing for a marathon, right, of training, that's what makes it all worthwhile, right? And if they were to just skip to the finish line, that wouldn't make it meaningful, right? So, I mean, in a way, we can, if that metaphor holds, then yeah, I think the point that you made about how it's important not to sentimentalize poetry education, right? It's very hard not to do that because as passionate educators, I mean, it's hard not to feel very passionate about poetry and to feel the sentiments, the emotional resonance involved. But at the same time, there has to be a certain kind of critical distancing that's vital as well. It's almost like a compartmentalization, right, of our approaches. So yes, yeah,
I think I'd go slightly further than what you're suggesting about AI. It's a conversation I'm having quite a bit in my work with talking to the exam boards here about the future of assessment, because we're in the, well, I wouldn't say we're in the middle of a curriculum and assessment review in England. It's supposed to be being reported now, but I don't know when it's coming. And it may be that there are some changes to the way that English is assessed. And one of the discussions I keep having is that the problem that AI presents is to assessment by essay. Now, under exam conditions, it's slightly different, but certainly in terms of coursework and submissions, like if you were a student, why would you not use AI to do that for you? But what I keep saying to the exam boards is that nobody can memorize and speak a poem for you. And I'm very influenced by Joy Alexander's work on speaking poetry, and she wrote a very good chapter about or an article about kind of a pedagogical practice between the First and Second World Wars, where learning to speak a poem was studying poetry. That once you will know this from your experience of doing it, that when you can speak a poem well, the chances are that you have understood it, you've got inside the voice, all of those things that you've said, because then you are inhabiting the poem, you're understanding it, and you're giving voice to better or worse effect. You are giving us the poem whole, with a kind of richer, deeper understanding. And that's something that AI can't do. It can't do it yet. Maybe one day it will, but it has to come from your voice and your heart and your mind. So I think that's my thinking around AI, that the cognitive offloading is one thing, but there's the thing that as humans we can do that a machine can't. And I think that as people in the humanities, we should be insisting on humanism. And I think that that's my argument about it, that learning a poem by heart and speaking it, and I will give way in a second to our facilitator, is one of the most humanistic things we can do.
Thank you very much for those comments, and for, I think that this discussion has really brought us to the most important questions that, beyond people who are interested in poetry education, specifically in education broadly, we're all really grappling with some of these big questions. So thank you for that. There are a few questions in the chat. So because we're recording this, I'm just going to read them. And since there are three, that's a nice, I think we probably have time for all three, but I'm going to read all the three questions and then turn it over to Wai Kit to address each of them. Okay, so the first question from Dominic Na: to what extent were the students' agency of choice genuinely their own, given that the researcher shortlisted the poems? What kind of poetry is implicitly valued in the text shortlist? And then the second question from Sharon George: Wai Kit, you indicated your preference for the learning objective of helping students discover poems that they would want to accompany them through life and therefore be motivated to memorize. Not being from your field, I'm curious to know if this is a mainstream or fringe view in literature education. And then finally, Balbinder Kaur Daliwal: one benefit is memorization. For example, one student already memorized scientific concepts before he was asked to memorize a poem. How would a teacher be able to convince students that memorizing poetry will help them to memorize other stuff?
Yes.
Maybe that was meant to be a comment that there's also something that may also be something utilitarian in memorizing of poetry for some students. Okay, Wai Kit.
Yes, thank you, Yeong. Thank you, Julie. So to Dom's question first about the students' agency, right, and choice. So I think this was a question that I was discussing precisely with the teachers in the study. So it was very important that we wanted to prioritize choice and to honor students' choices as much as possible. But at the same time, we had to be cognizant that, students are novice learners by definition, right? And the teachers are going to know more poems. So it's very hard not to almost impose certain perhaps preferences simply through text choice. Like imagine if we were to just give to force a particular poem on everyone. Now that would have worked, right? So in this case, we wanted to honor choices by providing a long list. And the thing is, there's no list that is perfect. I mean, every list is subject to implicit biases. I think that's important. And what the literature on it is suggesting, I actually had slides earlier on this, I didn't have time to share, and about text selection, is that, well, I mean, because we have to balance, for example, right? Like when you ask what kind of poetry is implicitly valued in the text shortlist, is it, for instance, canonical poems like Shakespeare, Milton, for instance, right? Or is it the Singapore poems, right? Something local that could be regarded as more culturally relevant in some ways, right? So, and that's a difficult call, right? And what about poems that are more sensitive in nature, for example? So how do we make that call? And the short answer is, well, the teachers and I came up with an initial list first, right? And there was a long list of poems. And interestingly enough, this long list was such that I have to credit Poetry Festival Singapore as well, right, for this, because our Poetry Festival Singapore volunteers and board members also contributed to this. So it was a group collaborative effort. So that aspect of community is vital. So that it's not just one individual's choice. Oh, I like Jabberwocky and therefore we'll all learn Jabberwocky by heart. No, right? So it was collaborative like that. And then if the students asked for particular poems to be added, well, as long as they were age appropriate, we just added it. Yeah, so generally, as long as there were no profanities, for example, we just added it. And they specifically mentioned that they appreciated this process. Right, okay, I'm just going to move on to the other questions as well, even though I could actually, if there's time, I'd like to go back to this point because I think it's important about text selection, right? And about the cognitive biases and the possible, some of the biases and assumptions that we as researchers and educators might have especially in these, what might be regarded as processes of canonization, right? Like whether or not there should even be a so-called canon, for example, yeah. So, but anyway, to Prof. Sharon George. So, Sharon, when you ask about whether it's a mainstream or fringe view with regards to the preference to help students discover poems that will accompany them through life and therefore be motivated to memorize, the short answer is it is currently a very fringe view. Yeah. So the mainstream view, at least in the Singapore context, and dare I say in many other literature education programs and systems around the world, is that the priority is on dissecting a poem, is on critically analyzing a poem. So that's why the entire school known as the New Criticism, right, has persisted till now, right, in which the incentive is for students to be able to encounter any poem and then write an analytical essay about it. Right? So, which is a very different way of viewing a poem, right? Is the poem an object to be dissected and to be analyzed, which it can be, and there is value in that. But at the same time, can it also be a source of inspiration, right? Can it also be a means through which the student can appreciate the essence, the presence of a text? And that's not covered by critical, analytical approaches towards the text. That's not what sparks joy in some cases. Right? It's about the performance of a poem, because poetry is an oral tradition and we need to reactivate that potential of poetry, right? Which is what Dr. Julie Blake and her team at Poetry by Heart do so well, right? And that's what Poetry Festival Singapore does. And that oral tradition, right, is what we can also activate even today in an AI age, because it's like what Julie mentioned, right? That the poem can't, I mean, it can so-called memorize a poem for us, but it can't perform it and feel what the poem feels like. It can't inhabit the voice of the speaker. Yeah, so yeah, in short, can we turn that fringe view into a mainstream view? I think it is very difficult because of practical assessment considerations. Yeah, so there are, of which I've just mentioned only really the tip of the iceberg. when with regards to assessment, with regards to time and to student readiness. These are just some of the evident factors, but can we truly appreciate a poem in all of its diverse aspects, right? As not just something not just unweaving the rainbow, to use a poetic metaphor, for example, but that we can really appreciate a text for what it is. Like, for instance, If by Kipling, right? I mean, even on a personal level, my late father read that aloud to me. He knew snippets of Coleridge by heart, and he would, in fact, and I didn't know it then, but then at the time he was quizzing me in a very good-natured fashion, like water everywhere, but not a drop to drink. Where's that from? And who said that? And so that was retrieval practice, essentially, and that was so important, and that sparked my love for poetry as well, right? So I think that's what we can afford to really reactivate in classrooms today. Okay, and then to the question about how will a teacher be able to convince students that memorizing poetry will help them memorize other stuff, right? Is this a rather utilitarian point of view? I think it is a very utilitarian point of view, and of course, it boils down to what we think the point of poetry is. Like, what is it? I'm reminded of that there's a scene, right, in the film Dead Poets Society, right, featuring Robin Williams, in which was asked, so what's when we had to do along the lines of what's the point of poetry, right? And he was saying, and I paraphrase, that all the other professions, right, like medicine, law, and business, and engineering, all these are great and noble professions, and they are necessary to sustain life, right? It's important, of course, but poetry, love, beauty, faith, all of these aspects, that is what makes life worth living. So in other words, the framework that he had, in which the class, right, depicted in the film, and dare I say perhaps today, if more students could also have a similar mindset, would be if we can see that the point of learning is envisionment building. It is about journeying with the text through life. And that if we look at the research from the learning sciences, right, that knowledge and skills are intertwined. So the more we read, the better we are able to write, for example, right? And therefore, I mean, we have a richer experience with text. So in the same way, if we know these snippets of lines, right, of poems, that enriches our schemas and in ways that helps us to write better essays, right? So learning poetry by heart is an immediate quote you can use when you introduce in the introduction paragraph of your GP essay. I mean, that is a very practical thing to have, to know, when you can immediately quote and cite automatically, because this is about automaticity, right? They know exactly what to quote and cite in that circumstance, and that takes practice, right? So I think that's something that AI can't do for us, right? It can't help us think of what's the right line in the right circumstance. It can't feel with the text for us. Yeah, it can't apply it to the exact circumstance because they have not felt the circumstance. Yeah. So, okay, I could go on, but I think I should, there are other questions.
Thank you. Those are great responses. There are two more questions, and I think we only probably have time for these two. Let me read them. The first, Don Xiao, is there any potential in connecting the utility of memorizing poetry to the memorization of song lyrics? Funny that poetry memorization should be seen as such a strange thing when hundreds of thousands of Swifties can bounce out the bridge of Cruel Summer and feel that it speaks to them. Are these so different? And then from Brian Yim, may I ask what are the benefits students reap from choosing their own poems to memorize rather than being assigned one? I guess circling back to that first question in a different way.
Nice, right? And I mean, of course, like Don, thank you for your question, because I mean, you know, Don is the consummate performer as well, and he himself, if I may mention, is also an accomplished poet and also spoken word poet, and he has learned many poems by heart and performed at Poetry Festival, right, in Singapore. So, so the short answer is yes. I would suggest that there is so much in common, right, between poetry and songs, and to be honest, the lines between them are really not very distinct, because I mean, and there is much literature on this, right? poetry is essentially such that it's, well, some would define as the best words in the best order, right? It is memorable speech, and that it should operate without music. So even when not set to music, the poem would still work so-called, right? But with songs that has to generally be accompanied with music, right? And so yes, Swifties can belt out, right, those songs, which, and actually that is aligned with exactly the same principles, right? And why? Because there is an emotional resonance involved, right? So it is not much different. And it so happens in this study, students did not happen to ask for Taylor Swift's lyrics to be added to the list. Although if that happened, I think I would need a discussion with the teachers as well, again, about whether we could include Cruel Summer. And maybe there is some value, because if you think about it, Bob Dylan, right? I mean, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature? Well, he won it for his song lyrics as well, right? The lines between poetry and songs are really indistinct. They are blurred for a good reason. They both speak to the soul in that very real sense, right? So I think that just as you wouldn't, not everyone can recite the entire, all the song lyrics. Maybe they know the chorus of their favorite song, for example. So who's to say that maybe students can just learn that particular verse, right? That matters to them, right? And I'm seeing in the chat as well. Oh yeah, Dom's adding to this when he says that songs have a set, perhaps songs have a set rhythm and melody that clearly guide the listener, whereas poems don't have a fixed one. I think that's possible, right? It's just that, what about free verse poems, right? So then that opens up a whole kind of worms, right, as well, because, and it's true. So for example, well, unless we are talking about like the sonnet or the villanelle, in which there is a melody in the words, there is the music of speech. One definition of poetry, right, is Amiri Baraka, I believe, who said that poetry is words musicked, right? Not set to music, but musicked as a verb, right? It is a melody of speech in that sense. Yeah. So, okay. Anyway, Brian's question as well, right? And what are the benefits that students reap from choosing their own poems? I think this goes back to agency and choice. Yeah. And I think this is so important. And it is interesting to see, if you have a poem that's assigned to you, you may not necessarily feel for it, right? But at the same time, it doesn't mean that that poem, that in 10 years' time, in 20 years' time, you wouldn't suddenly think, oh, maybe that poem actually meant something. It was really relevant. Sometimes, and texts are like this, right? It takes time for texts to mature in the mind, right? When we read a poem when we are 16, it's very different from when we are reading a poem when we're 26 or when we're 86, right? So that's important to recognize. And perhaps if we learn a poem by heart, whether it's if they choose it, then it's likely that their own interests are aligned to the text. And therefore, it's more likely that, at least at the point in time, they will feel for it, and that perhaps they would be able to recall it even better. But I would say there might be still value to assigning text as well, because sometimes the teacher might know the student even better than they know themselves. Yeah, there is a possibility of that. Although, yeah, I would say that there are caveats involved as well. Yeah. Oh, and yes, I think Judy added on a comment as well, right? Yeah, and yeah, and any oh, maybe I'll just read Judy's comment, or unless
Sure, please.
Yes, yeah, as well, that the poet Glenn Maxwell explains the song or poem issue very well as well. And the medium of song is sound, the medium of poetry is silence. They're connected in so many ways, but they're also different. Yes, absolutely, right? So, and I think that dynamic between sound and silence is vital. That in a poem, the silences matter. And that is also part of the beauty of poetry as well. Yeah, and yes, there is that poem that in the chat mentioned, Miracle on St. David's Day. I love that poem. It's about poetry by heart. Yeah, thank you for mentioning this. Yes, and this poem, as you said, is helpful for thinking about the idea that a poem learned at school can have long-lasting effects. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think that, and the thing about the character, the protagonist, right, the character depicted in the poem, is that he was mute as well. He couldn't speak, and hence it was institutionalized, right? But he, at that point in time, because the daffodils were in bloom, suddenly the words found him, right? It was the words that emanated at that point in time that stunned everyone, right? So everyone, if you haven't checked out that poem, please do check it out. Right? Thank you for the recommendation. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I feel like we probably could go on quite a bit, but we have to end here for tonight. So I'm just going to say thank you so much to Wai Kit for this really fascinating and rich discussion. In case you missed it earlier, Wai Kit had mentioned he already does have a published article on this topic, on this study. And so please look it up and read more and get in touch if you would like to connect and ask further questions. Let me also thank Dr. Julie Blake for your wonderful interventions and comments, as well as this poem I think you've gifted to all of us tonight, which I will read after this session. Thank you everybody for your wonderful questions as well. Video of this event as well as other events will be on Academia SG's YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Facebook and Instagram. I think we're also on TikTok. I'm not on TikTok, but I hear that Academia SG is on TikTok. So please follow us there if you're there. And if you like, please also sign up for our monthly newsletter. Thank you everybody for joining us, and I hope to see you again at our next event.